I'm John Alford. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about where I was at the beginning of the war. We were living in a small, on December 7th, 1941, we were living in a small rural town in California, and the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor at around 8 o'clock in the morning, at Hawaiian time. It was actually 11 a.m. on the Pacific coast. And to be honest with you, I don't remember much about what happened on that particular day, except I think we were at, I went to a small soda fountain ice cream parlor and talked to a couple of my classmates, and we had no idea where Pearl Harbor was. But the thing that I remember specifically was the next day, on December the 8th, in our high school, we heard the radio broadcast that President Roosevelt made when he addressed Congress, asking them to declare war on Japan. And after he made his radio broadcast, that afternoon in our high school, the principal had all of the students assembled in the auditorium, and he got up and he talked to us. He told us that he reiterated some of the things that President Roosevelt had said. He also said that our lives would be changed forever. But the thing that I remember specifically, which really didn't get too much, I was not really impressed at the time, but after I thought about it, was something. He stood in front of us, and he very slowly went like this, and some of you will not come home. Now, we were a small group, maybe 200 students in that high school. But that got to me a little bit later when I realized, yeah, he was right, because I had not the opportunity, but I did find out that one of my classmates had been killed on the USS Saratoga, which is, I can talk about that later maybe. But my dad was a World War I veteran. He had lied about his age to enlist in the Navy in June 1918. And after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted again. January the 1st, he was sworn in again in the Navy. And at the end of that school year, I was a junior in high school. At the end of that school year, we moved to Los Angeles. I finished my senior year in Los Angeles and enlisted in the Navy when I was only 17. I needed my mother's permission to enlist. She didn't want to sign the papers, but she told me that her reason was that the war would be over before I would be drafted. And I told her I wanted to enlist anyhow, I wanted to go in. As it happened, the war lasted another 25 months after I enlisted. Anyhow, she did sign the papers. I enlisted July 1943. After boot camp, which was 58 days, went to an assignment in San Francisco. I was in San Francisco for 7 months, and then I went to the Naval Air Station, Alameda, California. I was there for 14 months, and I really enjoyed it because I was flying. I got to fly in the rear cockpit of OS-2U Kingfishers and the SBD Dauntless dive bomber. But before I started flying, I went to a free gunnery training school, a class for five weeks, learned how to fire and assemble and disassemble the 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns. But I really enjoyed flying in the Kingfisher and the Dauntless. Even though I was not getting flight pay, I would fly at the drop of a hat. If they needed somebody to fly, it was me. I was ready. I'd go. So I flew a lot. I really enjoyed it. And after Alameda, I went aboard the aircraft carrier USS Wasp. They put me to work in the barber shop. I had no idea what a barber was like, but I learned. It was on-the-job training. Fortunately, the man that was in charge of the barber shop was a licensed barber from Pennsylvania, so I learned a lot from him. Now, while I was at Alameda, my dad was He had been assigned to, and he was on a carrier, an Essex-class carrier, was built in New York and Brooklyn, and he went to the Pacific. And let me back up a little bit. When after my dad was enlisted, he went to a small escort carrier in Norfolk. Their primary duty was to train pilots for carrier qualifications. And, so I'll jump ahead. When he went to the Bennington, which is an Essex-class carrier. They went to the Pacific, got out there to the war zone. And one of the first letters that I got from him was he told me about two of his friends that had been assigned to the USS Wasp. And he said if the Wasp ever came into Alameda, I should go see them, talk to them, and they would tell me what was going on out there in the war. So the Wasp did come into Alameda. She had been hit, took a bomb hit, and she lost 102 men. After their yard period in Bremerton, Washington, where they got repaired, they came into Alameda to pick up their air group and personnel replacements. And I was one of those personnel replacements. I volunteered to go aboard. My unit was ordered to send 4 seamen to the ship. So I volunteered, I went aboard. And in the barbershop, each enlisted man on their work uniforms, their dungaree shirts, they had their names stenciled on the back part of their shirt. And one day his man sat down in my chair, and I looked at the name, and I asked him if he had been on the Charger, and he said yes. And I said, my dad was on the Charger, he told me to look you up. And he says, what are you doing here on the ship? And I won't describe it the way he told me, but in effect he told me that my mother had raised an idiot when I told him that I had volunteered. After he left the chair, the man in charge of the barbershop came over and told me that this man had been awarded the Silver Star for the action that he did after the bomb hit. But unfortunately, I never saw him again. We had 3,400 men on the ship, so it was hard to keep track of anybody or find anybody. But I was aboard the Wasp. We went out to the Pacific and joined the war group, the task force, and we. Let me get my thoughts together a little bit. We were in Task Force 38. Later on, I'll be showing you some charts and some sketches of some of the breakdown to explain some of the task force duties. But we were in the task force. The war was supposed to be over on. Well, first let me explain. I'm getting a little bit mixed up, but bear with me. We were there with they dropped the 2 atomic bombs on August the 6th on Hiroshima, August the 9th on Nagasaki. We heard about it on the ship, but to be honest with you, we didn't know what an atomic bomb was. They didn't explain it to us really well. It didn't really matter to us, except that afterwards, after the 2 atomic bombs, the Japanese decided that they had had enough. And I had heard reports later on that the military people wanted to continue the battle. They wanted to continue fighting. But the Emperor Hirohito said, no, he's had enough. So on August the 14th, he said he was finished. So I didn't hear it, but the rumor on the ship was that the Admiral Halsey had sent out a dispatch to all the ships that the war was over, but if an enemy plane comes over, shoot him down in a friendly manner. I thought it was a joke at the time, but I heard later on that somebody else had heard on another ship, they'd heard the same thing. But it wasn't very funny at the time, until we found out that, yeah, we were at battle stations on that day, on August the 14th, after the war was over, supposedly. And there were 2 kamikazes at about 7,000 feet up above the ship. Now each carrier out there had what they call the Combat Air Patrol, the CAP, where they send 8 or 10 fighters up and form like an umbrella over the task group, the task unit, to intercept any enemy aircraft. So there were 2 Japanese kamikazes about 7,000 feet over our ship. And one of our fighter pilots shot one of them out of the air, and the other guy started his dive at us. And another pilot engaged him and hit him a couple of times in his right wing. But when he got within range of our guns, he broke off, and we continued firing. Now, I was an ammunition passer on a quad 40 millimeter mount. That's 4 40 millimeter guns on a mount. We were, my station was an ammunition passer. Our mount was just a little bit forward of 2 single 5-inch guns on the port side aft, right near the landing signal officer. If you see a picture of the Wasp back there behind me, on the right end, looking at the right side, the rear side of the ship is the stern area. My battle station was just a little bit forward of that landing signal officer. But anyhow, the kamikaze started his dive at us. We were firing, and I was busy passing ammunition to the loaders. We had 4 loaders loading each of the 40 millimeter guns, and I didn't have time to look up and see what was happening. But you can imagine, it took about 13 seconds for that kamikaze to come down at us. I think we were making a turn to the left, port turn, because and I also think that either the kamikaze pilot was killed, or else his controls were shut off, because he did not adjust his dive, and he hit the water about 50 feet off of our starboard bow. Later on, our gunnery officer told us that it was our gun sector, those 2 5-inch guns, and our our quad 40 mount. He told us that it was our gun sector that shot the plane down. I find that hard to accept, because there were so many other guns that could have been firing. On the island structure itself, there were 4 twin 5-inch mounts that could have been firing at the same time. So even though he said it was our sector that shot the plane down, I still can't accept that. But at the time, it sounded good. But that was the last kamikaze that was shot down during the war. And that was August the 14th. And August the 15th, we didn't hear it, of course, but August the 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced to the Japanese public that the war was over. Now, I'll get to it later on. I'll talk to you about the formation of a Navy task unit, a task group, task force. But we were all spread out. The whole task force was spread out over a huge area in the ocean, a wide separation of the ships. But this particular day, August the 22nd, all the ships came together in a very close formation. And I think I remember seeing a cruiser was probably 50 yards off of our port side. But we were very, very tight formation. And all of the aircraft that could fly, maybe 1,000 aircraft, flew over our combined forces about 1,000-foot altitude. It was a magnificent sight. And I could never find a YouTube video showing that flight over the task force. But you can imagine all of these ships, hundreds, maybe 250 or more ships together in a very tight formation when the planes all flew over. And August the 22nd, that was the flyover. On August the 25th, we hit a typhoon. And I think Dan will probably talk to you a little bit later on that. But the typhoon was really bad. We had winds of probably 70 miles an hour. And we had waves that were 55, 60 feet high. And we were going with the wind most of the time. And when we got within 50 miles of the Japanese shoreline, Admiral Halsey had us all turn around. So we turned around and went going into the wind, and we were dipping waves with our bow, with the bow. And I don't know if Sharman had a picture, but there was we lost about 30 feet of the flight deck. The two corners of the flight deck were bent down from the weight of the water that we were scooping up as we were coming up and down, fighting those waves. Shortly after that, we started launching planes. Our planes started delivering foodstuffs, medicines, and some liquor to the prisoners of war that were in the Japanese POW camps. I had the opportunity, not the opportunity, but had the occasion to meet a man many, many years later at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, when he saw my USS Wasp cap. And long story short, he was in one of those POW camps that we dropped food stuff and medicine to. So we had a few minutes to discuss that, which was quite an experience for him. So the war was over. We were on our way home. That was the big thing for us. I think there was a lot of anxiety, I guess, because some of the fellows had been on that ship since it was commissioned in 1943, and they had gone through, they experienced the bomb hit where they lost 102 men, and they were anxious as anybody to get out of there and go home. I think they were really happy that the war was over, like we all were. But I think it meant a lot to these guys who had been away from home since 1943. Anyhow, we stopped at Pearl Harbor. We had to stop at Pearl Harbor to remove some of there were 3 or 4 quad 40 mounts that had been installed on the starboard side of the ship in the yard period at Bremerton. Now, the Wasp and all of the Essex class carriers, their width was about 108 feet. Now, maybe some a little bit more. The Panama Canal, the locks in the canal were 110 feet wide. So originally when the ships were built, all of the Essex class carrier ships were built on the East Coast. And to get through the canal, Panama Canal, they couldn't have anything on the starboard side. But when they got out to the war zone, I think, I'm guessing at this, what the powers that be, the Navy Department, realized that they had very little firepower on that starboard side. Even though these 4 twin 5-inch mounts that were on the island structure could train to the starboard side, they had no 40 millimeters that could train. So they installed 3 or 4 mounts on the hangar deck on the starboard side. Now, we couldn't go through the Panama Canal with those gun mounts on there, so in Pearl Harbor they removed the gun mounts. We were in Pearl Harbor maybe a week while they did that, so that we could get through the Panama Canal. So we went through the canal and went to Boston. The Wasp had been built in Quincy, Massachusetts, which is a little south of Boston. And when we pulled into Boston, Boston was the first U.S. port we hit after going through the canal. They had the fireboats out there with their shooting their spray, red, white, and blue, water shooting spray up all over the place. And I realized that was my 20th birthday, and I realized they were not celebrating my 20th birthday. It happened to be Navy Day, October 27th, 1945. So this is after the war, but I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about what happened with me afterwards. After we were in Boston for a few days, we went to Staten Island, New York. They welded about 3,400 bunks. They welded bunks on the hangar deck. We picked up a few hundred Italian prisoners of war, took them back to Naples. This was part of the Magic Carpet operation, which is a whole other story. I can talk about that some other time. But I finished, I did 20 years in the Navy, I retired. I'm proud of my service. I'm very, very happy that I had the opportunity. And I tell people it was an honor to serve my country. But that's about the extent of it from my point of view. The war was over. Everybody was going home. Thank you. There'll be more later. Okay.